We do want to have an emphasis, again, on walkability, and that kind of involves us thinking of our cities in terms of kind of smaller units. Perhaps you want to call these neighborhoods or villages or districts, whatever the designation is. I think what I wanted you to do is kind of get a sense of, what are the extents of a walkable environment. I think the sentiment that's probably shared amongst many of you is that perhaps something at the scale of the entirety of downtown is perhaps a little bit too big to be thought of as kind of an area that can be walked comfortably. And that's maybe one reason that we did split up the sites into 3 different groups or 3 different zones. And that's definitely kind of the thinking that the city has behind, again, thinking of downtown in terms of a number of smaller districts. So if you check out the city website, you'll notice that they have designations for various areas. We have, for example, South Park as being one district in downtown, the Fashion District as being another. Closer to the river, we have the Arts District. So it's always kind of an interesting exercise in trying to get a sense of, well, what makes for a district? Is it something that has to do with maybe the period in which the area was developed, right? Downtown started growing around Main Street or Broadway in the early 1900s. So perhaps that should be kind of a district. The area around the Disney Concert Hall and the office towers, known as Bunker Hill, again, started seeing development in the post-war years, perhaps in the 50s, and maybe late 50s, and then starting in the early 60s and then 70s and 80s. So perhaps that should be a district. Now, of course, in addition to this idea of when an area was developed, you do have kind of current uses of a particular area that might imply, a way to kind of think about districts. And that perhaps is the idea behind something like a fashion district. So that's not, kind of speaking to sort of when the area was developed. So you do find kind of buildings from various eras and various epochs. But it has to do with its current use, right? As an area where you do have kind of small manufacturers, garment industry, perhaps some of the talent opening up, kind of workshops and offices in the area. So again, a different approach predicated on use and not on the age of the buildings. So again, keep thinking of these ideas, as we progress definitely through the course and through the program, I think it will definitely make for an interesting discussion in our classes and studios. Now, the topic that I'd like to talk about in a little bit more detail today is this idea of public and private space. Again, that's sort of been sort of a big component of the field trip, which did involve us going in and out a number of quote-unquote public spaces. And perhaps building on our observations, we can maybe try to enrich that discussion a little bit. So, I sort of, in preparation for this talk, maybe gave it a couple of minutes thought at first before starting to delve into it a little bit more detail, and I kind of asked myself this simple question: if I were to define this idea of a public space, I mean, what or the public realm in this regard, what would it be? And I just sort of noted down kind of the first thing that came to my mind, which is perhaps this idea that the public realm is the part of the environment to which the public has free access. I sort of knew, as I was writing this down, that this is perhaps a little bit too simplistic. Perhaps there's a little bit more to it. But again, I thought it might be a good way to sort of start thinking about this idea. Now obviously on our walks, we did go through a number of spaces with wildly different characteristics. Again, not all of us visited the same site, but at least the group that were walking with me did visit these two sites that I have on this slide. The one on the left is the atrium of the Los Angeles Central Public Library, and the space on the right are the 5th Street steps that take you down from near Hope Street by the end of Grand Avenue, all the way down to actually where the library is on your left. So, I think it's interesting to think of the sort of contrast, if you will, between these two types of spaces. On the one hand, you have the public library, which is enclosed, but is public, right? In the sense that anybody can go in and out, and it's actually owned and operated by the city. And on the other hand, you have something like the 50 steps, which is open, again, to the elements, not enclosed. But interestingly enough, at least in terms of its ownership, is private. So, again, owned and managed by the owners of the office buildings adjacent to it. So at least in the contrast between these two types of spaces, you can start to complicate this idea of public space. Perhaps maybe it's not a matter of inclusion. Perhaps issues of ownership are a little bit more complicated than what we sort of assume they are on the onset. A little bit further east, at the beginning of our walk, you might have passed along these two spaces. The first is the Civic Mall, where we have this kind of really interesting sculptural art installation known as the Triforium, and a little bit, if you keep on walking further west on Grand Avenue, you have California Plaza, which sort of is a sunken plaza that has quite a nice water feature, quite a good amount of seating around a number of cafes and restaurants and so on. Again, if you maybe want to think a little bit about the distinction between these two spaces, they do offer us kind of another layer to the story. So, the Civic Mall, again, a public space, publicly owned, but perhaps not the most inviting type of public space. So, you do have this hardscape surface, a little bit of greenery here and there, a few benches that nobody seems to find quite inviting at any time of the day, and just overpowering, if you will, kind of sculptural piece right in the middle. So perhaps some good intentions there, but a space that is not used, as much as it could have been, whether designed differently. On the other hand, the California Plaza, again, a pretty active and busy place. There are always, throughout the year, events that are planned. Again, the seating is quite extensive. A lot of it is movable. There's sort of like an amphitheater type effect, if you will, to the space, and the way, in the way that the seats sort of step up from the water feature. There's sort of like a stage area where you can sort of hold performances and so on. So again, perhaps an example that sort of came into being maybe 20, 25 years after the public space in the Civic Mall, but a lot more thought going into kind of how to design a public space that is, that is attractive and conducive to socialization and maybe a little bit more interesting. The caveat, obviously, in this particular case again, is that, again, if you look at questions of ownership, it just turns out to be that perhaps counterintuitively, the California Plaza is a privately owned space, whereas the Civic Mall is a more publicly owned space. But, again, the California Plaza perhaps being a more successful and more inviting public space in that manner, if you want to sort of think loosely about this idea of what this idea of public means. So this is sort of the lay of the land in downtown today. A lot of different spaces, a lot of some successful, some not. I thought maybe perhaps what we can do before outlining some issues in the debate that we need to think of to get a kind of a clearer definition, if you will, of what public and private means, is perhaps take kind of a short, quick tour through history and sort of get a sense of some of the more popular models, if you will, of designing for public space that have been replicated across the country. So what are some of the historical precedents? Maybe perhaps how have some been successful or more successful than others? We're not going to go far back in history, but if you want to take it maybe in the end, back in maybe mid-19th century, and especially more so in the communities out east, we can think of the public space in some of the smaller villages, and perhaps, again on the East Coast, or more specifically so in New England, as being some of the earliest examples of public spaces that we've had in this country. And so this term, the village commons, sort of describes this kind of small public space around which you would typically have had maybe perhaps a church, perhaps a civic building, maybe a number of commercial structures. It served a purpose. It was basically this nucleus of a community, if you will, around which communal life was structured. And again, even though this was maybe a model that was befitting of some of these smaller towns, if you will, it did find application as a historical precedent later on, in some larger cities. Obviously, the kind of idyllic, if you will, slow-paced life of the small town didn't last for long, right? Cities grew. We did have urbanization at a larger scale and a faster pace, throughout the 20th century. And this is kind of a nice image from back in the day in the 1920s, right here in LA, around the intersection of 7th and Broadway. Basically showing us kind of the hectic pace of life, at a time when a lot of development was happening, and I'm using this term, the clash, to kind of speak of a very exciting and transitionary, if you will, time in the history of the city. So it was definitely a clash of modes of transportation. Right? I mean, you see streetcars, and pedestrians, and vehicles, all vying for that right of way. It was definitely a clash of various types of different uses. We definitely had we definitely had housing. We started to see the rise of new types of commerce back in the day. perhaps the department store stands out as kind of that new type of commercial emporium that redefined the commercial landscape. And on the other hand, we also did have a clash of cultures. The early 20th century was a time when, when we had kind of a sustained immigration, perhaps a little bit more intense than we saw earlier on in the 19th century, especially from Southern Europe. And so, all of that put pressure, sort of unprecedented pressure on cities, and in some ways kind of made the case, if you will, for public space a little bit more strong. And for those early, kind of pioneer city administrators who were thinking of kind of maybe the uses of public space, all of these issues sort of, were to bear on that question. So, is public space again something that is to be used to kind of relieve congestion in the city? Should it be something that, is it a place where maybe natives and immigrants can meet, and perhaps immigrants can sort of be, acculturated, if you will, to the ways of the host country. So again, it was an interesting and lively debate. Now, debate is sort of one thing, but at the end of the day, you do have to come up with solutions. And solutions solve some issues, perhaps a little bit more successfully than others. And this is perhaps how I'd like to kind of look at the various solutions that have sort of become more prevalent over the years. So again, taking this a little bit early on, and again at the turn of the century, one kind of exciting idea back in the day was to create, that large park. So, and here I'm talking about something like perhaps, Central Park in New York City, right? Or maybe out here in LA, something like Griffith Park. So this was kind of that large green park, perhaps at the outskirts of the city, right? Where land was cheaper, and and I guess the finances required to kind of put this together weren't would be enough. And so, on the one hand, it was kind of a question of finances, but it was also a question of, well, what is it that we would like to see this park really do? And again, think about a time when you had kind of industrial cities that were, again, teeming with factories, smokestacks, right? Pollution, all of the ills, if you will, of the industrial city, basically necessitating perhaps kind of this idea of the park as the refuge, if you will, from the ills of the industrial city. And so this idea of a public space maybe perhaps became synonymous with the idea of kind of nature in the city. So you take the streetcar, or perhaps later on the bus, on a 10 to 15 minute ride out of town. You live close by, perhaps 30 minutes if you live further away, and there you go for that Saturday or Sunday. You'd be in an environment that's perhaps a little bit more healthy, a little bit less hectic, if you will, than what you experience in your day-to-day. So, and I deliberately kind of chose this older image rather than maybe perhaps a newer image of something like Central Park, just to perhaps give you a sense of the types of uses people had for these, for these open spaces. So, what do you, I know the image is a little bit blurry, but what do you guys see in this image? So there's a large body of water. What else? What are people doing? sitting around, right, having a picnic. So if we want to sort of describe this as kind of passive or active recreation, what would it be? Passive. More like passive recreation. So, so again, you know, if back in the day you worked at a factory and you only had one day off, and you wanted again to take the family away from the toxic environment, the hectic environment in which you live, something like kind of the outline park, or perhaps a term that sort of come into currency to describe it, which is the pleasure ground, would have been your refuge. Now, what's the downside of something like this? I mean, okay? It does some things well, but perhaps what could it?
Costly.
What could it be? The negatives of something like this? I heard costly, I think. So you did need to afford that fare, right? On the streetcar to get to that park again. So that is absolutely valid. What else?
There's a lot of maintenance that needs to be done on the landscape.
Right. And so, I mean, these are, you know, quite costly to build and quite costly to maintain. And at the end of the day, how many of these are we going to be able to, you know, to design for, right, in an urban environment? Not many, right? And so perhaps these two ideas, the idea of being able to afford a fare, right? And being able to, let's say, have the time, right, to get to wherever that park is, raises you know, questions of you know, equity in a way. Again, because you know, it might be that those more affluent might be able to avail of that amenity a little bit more than those on the lower rungs of society, and those perhaps that live closer by. And it's in this spirit that we, in some sense, that we started to see the rise of kind of neighborhood parks as public space. And the idea of the neighborhood park, again, is that if you have neighborhoods, you'd have one in each neighborhood, right? So, so this is not the park that you only visited, right, on a Sunday. Perhaps this is the park or the public space that you visited also at the end of the day, at the end of the workday. And again, in a time when the industrial city was, you know, did not wasn't as kind, let's say, to the worker, as perhaps it is a little bit more today, with some more progressive labor regulations put in place. The neighborhood park, again, was conceived of sort of as this place, right, where a worker can go and recreate for free, right? So whatever you earned, you could always go there. And again, I chose this image from back in the day. And interestingly enough, if you again, the quality might not be all that great, but if you kind of look closely, what you see is some gym equipment, some swings, and slides, and interestingly enough, these were meant for adults, not children. So what you have here is, you know, 30 and 40-year-olds basically using these swings, and not 5 or 6-year-olds, right? And so this idea of free play, or, you know, active recreation, was not one that was limited, right, to children. Again, it was this idea that if you were in a factory all day long, right, whatever you were doing, you know, perhaps you were, I don't know, you had your regimented menial task of, you know, taking two pieces of a machine and putting them together. That's all you did all day, you know, a repetitive task, 1 hour after the other. You sort of wanted to use recreation as a way to, you know, kind of be creative in how you explore, how you move about, and not be kind of confined, if you will, and constricted in terms of tasks that you would have done you've been doing all day long. So, so the neighborhood park movement, and it was a nationwide movement, had that in mind, but it also had in mind, again, this idea of kind of immigrant neighborhoods, if you will, and the idea of using public space as a way to assimilate, if you will, immigrants to the host community. Some of them did have buildings where immigrants would have classes, all sorts of classes in language and in arts and perhaps reading and so on. So again, it was a response to the industrial city, but also to this idea that perhaps again at a time of immigration, we need to do something to create that melting pot, if you will, that this country is all about. So, what would happen next? The suburban revolution. And this is an interesting image out of one of the first suburbs to be put up on Long Island, New York, a town called Levittown. And perhaps nothing too special about the layout of these homes, which unfortunately was sort of the predominant characteristic of suburbs.